What if the strongest warning in the royal family wasn't shouted, but whispered? That's the question echoing through palace corridors and public imagination right now. Because when you hear claims that Princess Anne has finally reached her limit, not frustrated, not irritated, but emotionally done, you understand immediately that this is not another routine royal spat. This is something far heavier, something final. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Princess Anne is not known for drama. She doesn't posture. She doesn't tease headlines. She doesn't play to the cameras. For decades, she has been the embodiment of duty without applause, turning up, carrying on, saying little, and doing everything. So when her name becomes associated with words as severe as never come back, people stop scrolling. They lean in. And here's the unsettling part. If someone like Anne is pushed to this point, the story isn't about anger. It's about heartbreak. Ask yourself this. How much would it take for the most disciplined member of the royal family, the woman who survived kidnapping attempts, relentless press pressure, and years of quiet sacrifice, to finally draw a line so sharp it cuts clean through blood ties? Because this isn't a moment born overnight. This isn't reactionary. This is pressure building over years. Layer upon layer. Silence stacked on silence. Loyalty stretched until it nearly snaps. While others spoke publicly, defended positions, or tried to reframe narratives, and stayed quiet. While debates raged over interviews, documentaries, books, and accusations, she worked. While relationships fractured, she held to a belief many insiders say she never fully abandoned. That family, no matter how strained, still mattered. That belief, reportedly, did not survive what came next. Here's where the story takes a turn most people weren't expecting. This isn't about sides. It isn't about popularity. And it certainly isn't about winning a media war. What allegedly broke and wasn't noise, it was intent. The sense that something sacred was no longer being misunderstood, but deliberately used. Think about that contradiction. A monarchy built on continuity, suddenly facing a form of disruption that doesn't ask to belong. It demands to redefine. For someone like Anne, who sees the crown less as privilege and more as obligation, that isn't just offensive. It's dangerous. And this is why the timing matters now. The royal family has faced scandals before. Infidelity, public divorces, even constitutional crises. But this moment is different because it isn't about scandal, it's about boundaries. About whether reconciliation still protects the institution or slowly corrodes it from the inside. And here's the uncomfortable truth many commentators avoid, and has never needed public approval. Which means if she reached a conclusion, it wasn't for optics. It wasn't strategic. It was personal. Some say she listened quietly. Some say she asked questions no one else dared ask. Others claim she waited longer than anyone realized, hoping something, anything, would shift. It didn't. And when hope disappears in someone who has built their entire life on endurance, what replaces it isn't rage. It's resolve. So before anyone debates whether Prince Harry or Meghan Markle should ever return, there's a far more unsettling question we need to confront. What exactly happened behind closed doors that made the royal family's quiet enforcer decide that silence was no longer loyalty? Because whatever that moment was, it didn't just change a relationship. It changed the rules. And what came next would force Princess Anne to stop absorbing the damage. And finally refuse to stand in front of it anymore. What does it mean when the quietest person in the room finally speaks? Because when someone like Princess Anne shifts from silence to certainty, it is an impulse. It's culmination. Years of watching. Years of absorbing. Years of choosing restraint when others chose reaction. This is the woman who built her reputation on turning up without complaint. The royal who didn't trade dignity for headlines. The one insiders have long described as the family's internal compass. Not loud, not sentimental, unmoving. So when reports suggest and reached a point where words had to be said, the real question isn't what she said. It's why now. For years, and reportedly stayed out of the Sussex drama publicly. No interviews, no leaks, no coded statements. While narratives shifted and positions hardened, she remained exactly where she had always been. Working, steady, and loyal to the idea that family conflicts should not be performed for an audience. That silence wasn't indifference. It was endurance. And endurance has a limit. Here's the contradiction most people miss, and is often described as tough, but those close to the institution have long hinted that she's also deeply protective, especially of legacy, especially of continuity, especially of the late Queen's belief that the monarchy survives not through emotion, but through discipline. That's why what allegedly unsettled and wasn't criticism. It wasn't resentment. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was repetition, the sense that the same wounds were being reopened again and again, that explanations had turned into patterns, that reconciliation wasn't being sought, it was being postponed, then monetized, then reframed. Ask yourself this. How many times can you explain your pain before it starts to sound like strategy? And, by all accounts, notice that shift. Not overnight. Gradually. The tone changed. The framing changed. The timing changed. And when someone who values restraint notices excess, alarm bells ring. This is where the emotional weight enters the room. Because Anne is not known for issuing ultimatums. She doesn't dramatize betrayal. She doesn't deliver speeches. Which means if she reached the conclusion that distance was no longer optional, it wasn't to punish. It was to protect. Protect the institution. Protect her brother. Protect the memory of a reign built on service rather than spectacle. And maybe, this is the most painful part, protect herself from the exhaustion of hoping something would finally settle. So when people ask, why didn't she speak earlier? The answer may be uncomfortable. Because she believed she didn't need to. Until suddenly, she did. Until silence stopped functioning as patience and started looking like permission. And that realization changes everything. Because once someone like Anne decides that saying nothing is doing more harm than speaking up, the words that follow are never casual. They're measured. They're final. And those words, according to sources, didn't come with anger. They came with clarity. But clarity often arrives only after a final trigger. And in the next moment. The one no one outside those walls was supposed to hear about. A line was crossed that Anne could no longer rationalize, defend, or absorb. And that moment is exactly where this story turns from endurance into refusal. What would make someone who has endured everything finally stop enduring? Because this wasn't about irritation. It wasn't about bruised pride. And it definitely wasn't about headlines. The moment that allegedly changed Princess Anne's posture toward the Sussex situation was something far more unsettling. The realization that a boundary she believed was understood wasn't respected at all. Every family has an unspoken rule. A line you don't cross because crossing it changes the relationship forever. For Anne, that line was never about disagreement. It was about intent. Here's where the story sharpens. According to those familiar with the atmosphere at the time, Anne became increasingly uneasy not with what was being said publicly, but with how often private matters seemed to find their way into public narratives. Again, and again, and again, what once felt like catharsis began to feel like leverage. Think about that shift for a moment. When pain is shared once, it's vulnerability. When it's shared repeatedly, with timing that benefits visibility, contracts, or positioning, it starts to look different. Less like healing, more like currency. And for someone like Anne, who has spent her life protecting the distinction between public duty and private sacrifice, that distinction matters more than almost anything. This is where the alleged red line emerges. Not a single sentence, not one meeting, but a pattern that suggested the institution itself was no longer just being criticized, it was being used. Used as context, used as contrast, used as a backdrop for personal narratives that never truly ended. Ask yourself this. If every attempt at closure leads to another chapter, is closure ever the goal? Sources suggest and ask that question quietly, repeatedly, and each time, the answer became harder to justify. What reportedly disturbed her most wasn't confrontation. It was escalation. The sense that there was always another layer coming. Another revelation. Another framing that ensured the story never settled, never healed, never stopped drawing blood. That's when disappointment hardened into resolve. Because Anne understands something many don't. Institutions don't collapse from one attack. They erode from constant pressure. From being pulled apart thread by thread, until there's nothing left to hold together. And suddenly, the issue wasn't whether reconciliation was possible. It was whether reconciliation was safe. That's a brutal realization for someone who values family above comfort. And yet, it's exactly the kind of realization Anne would take seriously. So when she allegedly spoke up, it wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was private, controlled, and devastatingly clear. Because what she understood in that moment was this. Continuing to leave the door open wasn't generosity anymore. It was exposure. And once that truth settled in, and did something she almost never does, she stopped negotiating with hope. And when someone like Princess and stops negotiating, the next words aren't a suggestion. They're a boundary. And those words, the ones that followed, would land with a finality no one in the room could ignore. Because what came next wasn't about compromise at all. It was about drawing a line that, once drawn, could never be erased. What if the most devastating sentence wasn't shouted, but delivered calmly? Because the words that allegedly followed weren't theatrical. They weren't laced with anger. There was no raised voice. No dramatic pause meant for effect. And that's exactly why they landed so hard. Never come back sounds brutal when stripped of context. Cold, punitive, final. But according to those who understand Princess's mindset, that phrase wasn't exile. It was containment. Here's the uncomfortable contradiction. And has always believed in family. Fiercely. But she believes in boundaries more. And when boundaries are crossed repeatedly, the response isn't louder rules, it's distance. Distance as protection. And the issue was never whether forgiveness was possible. It was whether forgiveness still served a purpose. At some point, mercy stops healing and starts enabling. And that's a line she has never been willing to cross. Think about the irony here. The woman accused by critics of being emotionally reserved may have been the only one willing to acknowledge the emotional damage happening in real time. Not the damage to reputations, but the damage to trust, to continuity, to the idea that some things are held, not traded. And this is where the meaning of those words shifts. Never come back wasn't about geography. It wasn't about passports or palaces. It was about access, emotional access, institutional access, the right to keep returning to a structure while simultaneously dismantling it. And understood something critical. You cannot rebuild a house while someone keeps removing bricks and calling it renovation. So the boundary wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as preservation. Preservation of a legacy built by a woman who believed duty came before comfort. Preservation of an institution already fragile from decades of public scrutiny. Preservation of a family that had already lost too much to constant fracture. And maybe, this is the hardest truth, preservation of her own limits. Because endurance without end is not strength. It's erosion. When and allegedly reached that conclusion, there was no dramatic fallout. No leaks. No rebuttals. Just a quiet recalibration. A recognition that the door remaining open had become an invitation to more damage. And that's why those words felt final. Not because they were cruel, but because they were clear. Ask yourself this. How often do we mistake firmness for hostility? How often do we label boundaries as rejection because they deny us continued access? And didn't deny love. She denied repetition. She denied the cycle. She denied the idea that time alone fixes wounds that are reopened on schedule. And in doing so, she may have done the one thing no one else was willing to do. Accept that some relationships don't end in reconciliation, but in distance that prevents further harm. But here's where the story doesn't settle. Because while those words may have closed one door, they opened another question entirely. One that still hangs over the monarchy, unresolved and deeply uncomfortable. If Princess and the family's quiet enforcer, its last internal line of defense, has truly stopped believing reconciliation is possible, what does that say about what she knows? And more importantly, what does it mean for everything that comes next? So what breaks someone who never breaks? Not scandal, not noise, not even betrayal on its own. What breaks someone like Princess and is repetition without remorse, damage without pause, and the slow realization that endurance, once noble, has quietly turned into consent. When we circle back to the beginning, to that unsettling idea that the strongest warning is often whispered, everything about this moment starts to make sense. And didn't explode because she isn't wired that way. She concluded. And conclusions are far more dangerous than anger. For decades, she watched the monarchy survive storms that should have capsized it. She watched private pain stay private. She watched duty override ego. That was the unspoken contract. And contracts only matter if both sides still honor them. What makes this moment so haunting isn't the alleged words themselves. It's what they represent. The moment someone stops believing the cycle will ever end. Think about